Thank you to you all on a kind of Friday evening coming to listen to me talk about V&A East. And it is a subject I am deeply passionate about. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk about it. And I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, your questions, your concerns. As Sarah said in her opening, that in my previous role, I was the director of the National Museum of African and Art in Washington, DC, which is part of the Smithsonian family. And I came back to London 2 years ago, actually on the very last plane to leave DC before lockdown, and managed to get on just my cat and I. And, you know, I love my time in DC, but just so delighted to be coming home. And, you know, I had no idea because, you know, of course, I don't think many of us did what COVID would actually kind of wreak upon the arts sector. And it has been a really kind of quite a testing and interesting year in which to begin a new role. But one of the kind of most powerful kind of legacies and of this kind of harrowing last 2 years has been the profound impact of so much change and tumult on our psyches. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, whose interest wasn't actually piqued by the Great Resignation? I mean, I read those articles about the big quit with a little bit of longing. I mean, who wasn't kind of a little bit envious of all those friends who made the decision to swap full-time jobs for the countryside and the good life? And, you know, it's compelling to think about paring life back and leaving work responsibilities behind and finding a new life balance. But I mean, at heart, for me, even though those sorts of things are really tempting, I'm a city boy and I absolutely love my present job. And so, in all honesty, escape was never really on the cards. But this last couple of years has really left me changed. Would you mind turning your mics off, please? Because there's quite a bit of ambient sound. Thank you. Thank you very much. And after this last couple of years, I now kind of watch grand designs with a different kind of pleasure. And when I kind of make train journeys, particularly out of London, I do look out of the window with a bit of longing. But in all honesty, I spend my moments longing for a different kind of escape. I want a new kind of cultural discourse. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I really long for. A new kind of cultural conversation, a shift away from this period in which we seem absolutely obsessed in certain areas of the press with this kind of suffocating war on woke, the culture wars, the kind of deepening polarizations that one sees within so many areas of the press. And I actually think that they've had a really adverse effect on culture. It's actually choked away some of the more sort of radical, confident pleasure from our sector. And I want us to be able to rightfully, loudly laud those who are doing the really difficult and brilliant work of trying to make our sector more equitable, more open, and more representative of those that we serve. I see them personally as being heroes who should be thanked, who should be supported, who should be funded, who shouldn't be pilloried by the press and harangued by social media. And I've actually kind of written about this and I've spoken about this as widely as I possibly can, that the aspirations of greater equity within the arts sector, that these aren't new things. They are part of a shared aspiration of the publicly funded arts sector. I mean, if you actually go back to kind of founding charters, you go back to those early sorts of documents that really sort of drove the initial thinking around the foundation of so many of our public arts institutions. I mean, which one of them was not founded upon the aspiration of truly touching, of truly inspiring and changing the lives of us all, rather than just an elite few? Which museum or which gallery doesn't actually want to demonstrate rigor, compassion, and to demonstrate the moral courage to challenge the inaccuracies and the wrongs of the past? Trying to be truly inclusive, it might feel in this moment like a radical set of innovative objectives, but they are old. They are timeless. And I think that they remain noble, true, beautiful. They remain our founding raison d'etre as a sector. And yet, I think we have to do more than dream. I mean, if you think about those pioneers of the British National Museum project, they wanted to build a sector that offered universal benefit. They created a sector that was designed, as they saw it, for everyone. But what they meant by that needs really to be revisited. They didn't seem to truly value equity of provision. They sought to deliver a grand museum project that was on behalf of everyone, that delivered benefit to the nation, but not discrete benefit to its citizens. And one of the many things that have been profoundly changed by this time is how we see public institutions and how institutions might see their relationship to their audiences. We serve you. We collect, conserve, and keep our collections for you. We are here to uplift and to inspire, to transform thinking and opportunity. We are not just here to offer universal and abstract benefit to the nation, but real, tangible benefit to you. And so, in this time in which we're probably all thinking a little bit about dream escapes, my escape would be from one conceptual reality to another, not just from the constraints of culture wars, but from the conceptual patrician aspirations of conventional museology. I want us to transition from doing glorious things on behalf of our nation to begin to develop program with our varied audiences, to reinterpret the proclamation that the arts are for everyone as not being on behalf of them, but with them, by them, and truly for them, and for the benefit of all of our wonderful audiences. And that is what I'd like to speak about today. And as I've said, it's been a really odd time to begin a new role in the arts. I mean, these are kind of unusual times that we're living through, challenging times. And we probably all felt, everyone who is in any way even tangentially interested or involved in the creative industries, that we probably appreciated the strength of the arts. We've seen how, when we desperately needed it, we've witnessed the unique power in this period of the arts, of how culture can pull us together, how it can offer catharsis and inspiration. And in my memory, I mean, I really have kind of thought about this, but I do think the arts have not felt, at least in my lifetime, more critical, more important, more useful, but also more contested. And as so often in our history, when we felt challenged, the V&A has sought to play its part, to be impactful, to be inspirational, and to make a meaningful difference. And these are the qualities that have made me really proud to join this institution at this time. That we've been imaginative and we've been bold when it truly counted. Could we go to the first slide, please? We've taken what was a testing conundrum of actually losing our old collection centre at Blythe House. And I don't know if you've been to Blythe House. It's a collection centre that's sort of, I don't know, out of a Dickens novel. I mean, it's in West London. If you ever saw Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, it's the building that they used as MI6, and it looks like MI6 in the sort of 50s. It's lots of long corridors and lift shafts and dark rooms, and it's romantic and beautiful in its own way. But it's not a sort of space that you would really want to invite the public in its broadest sense. That this is a space that academics and museum specialists have grown to love over generations, but not a space within which you would want to engage a new audience in thinking about how they might potentially see transformative or inspirational things, or potentially gain professional development opportunities. And so we lost that space as the government kind of decided that it was a building that had served its time, quite rightly. But what we did was we didn't seek to build a new space outside London, that we turned the losing of Blythe House into a proposition that delivers in innovative ways to the needs and opportunities of this particular time. And what we've done is to create a new kind of collection centre at Here East, a space that is going to utterly revolutionise access to our collection and provide a universal, an unprecedented kind of access, a free flat platform from which we can tell new stories of theatre, of performance, of art, 280,000 objects. There's actually 1,000 archives, 360,000 books in a single building. And as you can see from this image, open central space, glass balustrades, glass floor, you'll feel like you're literally immersed within the collection. Could we have the next slide, please? And then around that we're going to provide the workspaces, the tools, the advice, all of the support systems needed by our visitors to study and make use of our collections in new ways. So this isn't just going to be a state-of-the-art institution that's going to serve artists and scholars. We want to build something that's going to help to catalyse young ambition and transform lives, and transform the lives of some of the most culturally underserved communities in Europe. This is a needed new kind of space that's going to help us focus upon makers and makers in new and important ways, and driven by what I think is a truly timely ambition to inform, to inspire, dynamised by the acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers, but this will need to be a shared and a collaborative endeavour. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Since I began this role, it's been a real privilege. It's been lovely to be home. I do love Britain. And I've thrown myself into this project, and I haven't actually done very much travelling outside of London. But one of the first trips that I did actually outside London was to visit an old friend who is also one of the greatest living ceramicists, Magdalena Dundo. And she, I don't know if you know her or her work, but she lives out in Surrey, that's where her studio is sited, has made an incredible life there, an incredible body of work. And she's a great friend of mine, but I hadn't actually seen her before the summer for more than a decade. And although our lives had diverged, I'd actually kind of followed Magdalene's successes in newspapers, visited her exhibitions, and also kind of remotely celebrated her winning of prizes and all of these kinds of amazing plaudits from a distance. And I felt huge vicarious pleasure when I read in the paper that she'd actually been awarded a damehood. It was so well deserved. I mean, she'd actually earned that love and respect over decades of teaching, of championing the arts, of producing truly exquisite ceramics, as you can see here. And these pots, if you know them, I'm sure that you'll agree with me, that they are rendered with a kind of uncanny, unearthly precision, unreal in their perfection, exuding a sense of almost being born, of being nurtured into the world rather than being made. And pulling into her drive, I was really so excited to see her, to find out what she was working on and to hear her news. But even silhouetted within the door frame, you could tell that there was something about Magdalene that suggested that things weren't quite right. And her greeting was as warm and as lovely as she ever was. But there was something in her countenance that suggested something else. And I wanted to hug her, but COVID, of course, I couldn't. And I wanted to ask, but courage escaped me. And then over lunch, she began. She said, I've been unwell, you know, Gus. And she told me this story that I found really affecting. She had suffered an illness that had forced her to spend months in hospital, some of it really gravely unwell. And it was an illness that, even as it retreated from her body, lashed out, threatening her motor functions. And even months into recovery, it continued to compromise her dexterity and her finger sensitivity, the most vital tools in a potter's arsenal. But it was at her most physically vulnerable that she was reminded of the power of her practice. Could we have the next slide, please? We all know those stories of how creative compulsion can drive artists. We know about Turner, who in creating this image, he had to lash his torso to a ship's mast to capture the visceral intensity of a storm on canvas. Could we have the next slide, please? Now, we probably know this image, which is one of my favorites. It's an Ibrahim El Salahi. And there's an amazing story behind this body of work, of how he risks his life to clandestinely make this body of work on the discarded cigarette packets of his guards, whilst he's incarcerated in one of the most horrible jails in the world, the notorious Koba prison. And we know that to create this, he had to sacrifice hugely. We know that that drive to create, it's fundamental. But this was something else. What Magdalene demonstrated, this wasn't a railing at the world, not a drive to make art at any cost, but an even more elemental desire of making being a kind of spiritual sustenance, of it being necessary to life, of the creative instinct being an existential catalyst, of a force for well-being. And Turner himself, he acknowledges that a gift of such incandescent talent, it could be a mixed blessing, that it could compel an artist to go to almost unhealthy lengths to achieve their goals. It's a view that seems to imply that genius almost resides as a sort of discrete entity that possesses one, an alien compulsion hosted by humanity with its own formidable feral drives. Could we have the next slide, please? But here, as evidenced in her work, Adundo's need to create, it's not driven by an act of defiance. Her need to create is deeply recuperative. Her drive to make is a drive to be. And when you look at this absolutely exquisite practice, it conjures its visual language from some sort of deep shared place of solace and succor And you understand how after years of investing in a bank of such beauty, that when Magdalene needed it, it would repay her. So my journey home was fueled by the inspiration of the afternoon, of musing on Magdalene's strength, on her talent, and on her work. For some, to create isn't a choice, it's an existential need. And to enjoy the fruits of creative genius, it shouldn't be a privilege. I think it's the quintessence of what it is to be a human being. And in this time of global recovery and reflection, as resource tightens, as humanity itself recuperates, I think we need to embrace museums and galleries as necessary places of solace and reflection, as spas for the soul, spaces where we might enjoy the most glorious manifestations of that fundamental human drive to make, to create, to be. Making is the driver of our earliest intelligent compulsions. Before we can walk, before we can talk, we exhibit a desire to make, to craft, to construct. And that compulsion links cultures across geography and across time. It unites us and makes sense of us. And when fate threatens us, that desire could be our life draft. From the work of our most lauded artists to our very earliest daubs, to the manufacturing and creative sectors that underpin our economy, making underwrites who and what we are. And I want that compulsion, that fundamental drive, making, to be the inspiration for what we do at V&A East. Because in a time when there seems so many reasons to retreat, to contract, to err on the side of caution, I think it's right that we've been bold, that we've asked that big question. What difference can the arts really make to the lives of people in our city, in our nation? How can we inspire and facilitate really meaningful discourse? How can we educate, empower, engage? How can we facilitate a new generation in crafting new thinking? And I really feel, returning to Britain after living for a number of years in Washington, DC, I feel it's so clear how post-Brexit, post-COVID, this nation, a populace, a culture, a transformed cultural sector, that we have to find the spaces within which we can convene shared conversations. And I would love V&A East to be one of those spaces. It does feel, though, despite all of the challenges, that we have a real opportunity to negotiate a new way of thinking about cultural engagement. And we've taught for generations, this is one of the things that Sarah raised at the beginning, about how we address issues of diversity and equity. And in so many museums, we've punted these things down the road, that we've created particular kinds of programs, particular moments within our calendar when we try to focus upon them. We've been waiting for some magical moment when the stars align, when resource and needs are going to marry. But I think it's no longer viable for us to keep waiting. We now have to act. I think the sense of urgency and the risk of not acting now far outweighs the perceived risks of trying and making mistakes. I think this moment forces us to revisit the moral tenets upon which we actually established the museum project in the first place. The tenets upon which we collect and retain objects, the premises upon which we curate our collections, and the stories that we choose to tell through them. Perhaps more than any time in my life, museums are asking humbling questions, some of them existential, and facing cuts in resource and personnel. We are probably less robustly equipped to make many of the desired adjustments, but we have to find a way to do so. We have to be bold. We've got a job to do. And it's as important as any challenge, I think, that has been faced by any generation within the arts. A job to contribute to not just to broadening equity, but to the healing process through the arts. And how are we going to do that? These are huge, huge challenges. But I think some of the clues actually lie in our past. Could we go to the next slide, please? As I'm sure you know, Henry Cole, the founder of the V&A, he wanted his museum to be a force for transformation. He wanted his museum to be radical. He hoped his V&A would offer the kinds of tools that would meaningfully change ordinary lives. And so he was actually really bold. Next slide, please. The V&A under Cole was the first museum to implement gaslighting and late opening hours. And this was to allow ordinary men and women to be able to visit after work. It's the first museum to have a cafe to provide rest and social opportunities, studios, and a broadly accessible library for practical study. And it's a beautiful vision. The investment in creativity, the celebration of makers and making, the foregrounding of people, the respect for discipline and practice, the focus upon staff, our partners, our visitors, our creative communities, the embracing of great practice wherever it comes from. And these are qualities that are woven warp and weft through V&A history. They underpin what we are and what others have loved about us over generations. They are principles upon which we must build V&A East. But we have to recast that Cole vision for the 21st century, for a younger, more diverse audience than any other national museum has ever attracted. And we want to remake those aspirations for the digitally native, and also for a rapidly changing arts sector. Next slide, please. So I spent a lot of this lockdown couple of years trying to rediscover London. And I've spent a lot of time cycling through areas that you probably know better than me, through Newham, through Tower Hamlets, through Hackney and Waltham Forest. And these are the 4 boroughs that surround V&A East. Not just to rediscover its contemporary story of demographic complexity, of artists, of digital enterprises, of small creative cottage industries and digital innovation, but also to discover something of the heritage of this bit of London. And it is a truly glorious and fascinating history. Long before artists like Yinka Shonibare set up his studio here, or before designers like McQueen came to study here, before David Bailey was born here, this was always a place of makers, of immigrants, of artists, and of shifting populations. I mean, the Lee Valley that you can see right at the top right-hand side of this picture, this was the place that saw the manufacture of the world's first electric light bulb, the invention of the first diode, the first solid-state colour television was made in Enfield, while in Hackney Wick, the first plastics were manufactured at the Parkside Works. Petrol was first refined to power cars here. This was a place that exudes that history of making, of invention and creativity. And you can still see that heritage playing itself out in the huge community of artists that continue to make their lives and their practice here. But that wonderful narrative of creativity and innovation, it doesn't really capture the full story of this place. Even though it's a stone's throw from the city, if you were to pivot from this position that you can see on your computer screen, you would be able to see just further to the left, the city. You know, that post-Brexit, this is going to be this tiny kind of square couple of miles is going to be the area that's going to produce more than a third of Britain's income. But this bit of London, if you pivot in the opposite direction, is also a place that is defined by the lives of its majority. It's a place of chronic underinvestment, of huge demographic flux. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I think it makes sense that amongst these communities who have over centuries given so much in creative energy to Britain, that the culture sector, supported by the Mayor of London, by central government, that we're investing in a new cultural hub, a new centre of making and makers. And it's a place that you probably know, it's on the Olympic Park, to the south of Stratford Station and Westfield Shopping Centre. And there will be a new UCL campus, so it's going to house things like their robotics schools, their architecture schools, and it's going to become home to 4,000 students and more than 200 academics. A new set of state-of-the-art BBC music studios and auditoria that's going to become home to their orchestras, a new Sadler's Wells theatre and dance studio, and the vast London College of Fashion building that's going to bring together their 5,000 students from across their varied sites. And this influx of students, of cultural institutions, of shoppers, of supporting infrastructure, it's not just going to transform East London, it's going to shift the creative commercial axis of our whole city eastward. I think it's going to transform geography, lives, and certainly the local economy. And I see East Bank as a kind of contemporary Coles Exhibition Road, a creative campus capable of shifting our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, of transforming the relationship between the academic world and the creative, between our publics and opportunity. I think it's the perfect antidote to this post-Brexit moment, an investment in our future, in our young, in skills, in the overlooked and in the underserved, in a diverse, dynamic, creative Britain. We have a chance at V&A to become a confluence of these communities, to draw together this highly diverse set of communities with opportunity, with inspiration, but at its core, the thing that links all of this is making. On to the next slide, please. And we also want to bring our collections to East London, to transform the way in which they work and the way in which they're seen. And this is going to be a new kind of collection centre. It's going to, I think, revolutionise the way in which we, the public, see collections within museums. Because it's about providing truly universal, unprecedented and free access to our collections. And these are great collections that of theatre, of performance, of art, of design. 280,000 objects in a single building. And what I love about this is that it's the actual form of the building speaks to the kind of openness that we want the institution to represent. So glass floors and balustrades, that's idea of actually, rather than standing outside the case, but of being inside with the objects. And then around that, the workspaces, the tools, the advice needed to try to animate and to bring to life some of the sorts of histories and areas of interpretation, but also to catalyse young ambition and hopefully to transform lives. And then around that, we want to create the spaces where we can actually bring to life some of the sorts of things that make museums possible, the areas of conservation, the behind-the-scenes tours, the studios and the classrooms where we can deliver material-based talks and lectures and courses. And then partner with universities to augment our teams and networks, to offer a huge reservoir of on-tap expertise and advice, to drive research programs, and to give young people access to the very finest material culture, contextualized by the best specialists. Next slide, please. I mean, my early museum memories were of distance and barriers, and we want to change that. to really immerse and expose young people with it to exceptional things, and to give them the knowledge and skills to learn about context, tradition, technique, and wherever possible through hands-on contact, and to build those connections across geography and time, and perhaps to inspire their own practice, to use this collection as a vast open source book to catalyze dreams. And the sheer scale of it, it's going to allow us to do the sorts of things that, as the V&A, we have longed to do over generations. Next slide, please. I mean, for the first time, we're going to be able to display vast theatre backdrops like this one, and display them as they were actually conceived and used. Significant architectural installations as they were originally experienced. I mean, this is a backcloth from the 1926 Ballet Russe production of Stravinsky's Firebird, and it is 15 meters wide. I mean, you could put a row of average London semis in this space. It's a vast, vast backdrop, and we can display these kinds of objects for the very first time, and we also can, because of the way in which the space is facilitated, we can that once it's actually on display, it's not on display for years. We can actually kind of revolve those displays as well. Next slide, please. We can display the whole of Frank Lloyd Wright's office. You know, this is an office which was designed by Edgar J. Kaufman in the 1930s, but we can display it with all of its original woodwork, its furniture, its carpets, and its textiles. Next slide, please. We can install this glorious, newly restored, actually restored in East London, a 29-part, 5-column, 17th century colonnade from Agra in India. And then around it, in adjacent cases, we can explore the techniques of carving and wood inlay through detailed displays. And then one of my favorite objects, next slide, please. One with a truly East London provenance is a huge chunk of the facade of Robin Hood Gardens. This is 3 stories extracted from the failing concrete fascia of one of the great prototypical brutalist 70s blocks of flags. And unlike other things that we're going to have on display, they're like Molly Goddard's dresses or Magdalena Dundo's pots that are going to, of course, follow. This was one of the first pieces that was actually installed. We had to crane this into the space, and it's actually anchored into the superstructure of the building. You can actually see that on the left of this image of how it's been put in place and where it's actually going to sit. And I mean, this is something which took months and months of planning, of discussing, testing, engineering, and choreography. And eventually, a few months ago, it actually found its place in the collection centre. And it's from a tradition of buildings that have earned the descriptor brutalist. And so, you know, we all know that even though they were so often vandalized and criticized by the communities that they were designed to serve, they were even, I guess, considered to have failed on their own terms by some within the profession that created them. But placed here within a museum context, it's also, I think, it's possible to understand how the announcement of the actual intent to demolish Robin Hood Gardens actually inspired one of the biggest campaigns in architectural preservation. But despite all of the campaigns to save this building, a decade ago, the application to give Robin Hood Gardens listed status was actually denied, and demolition was approved, and its deconstruction began. And it was only whilst it actually kind of lay dying like a sort of prone beast that I actually came to discover Robin Hood Gardens and to understand that what was actually perceived as something of an urban nightmare was actually conceived as a utopian dream. Its architects, Alison and Peter Smith, they actually sought to craft something of integrity and beauty. And it actually, looking at it, particularly when I saw it in our space, it reminded me of some of my first experiences of education. And they actually unfolded in a small primary school in South London. It's one of those Victorian schools with long, dark corridors and period parquet floors and enamel ceramic brickwork. And it kind of exuded a sort of creaky patrician sensibility that, at least to me, when I must have been about 6 or 7, it felt in diametric opposition to anything creative. And I would long for afternoons when I would actually be whisked by my childminder to her flat. And she lived on the 12th floor of a nearby council block. And it was new, gleaming, sleek, futuristic. I can remember those kind of concrete surfaces being sharp and clean. It was impossible not to fall in love with. And it wasn't just that you could see the South Downs from the kitchen window and the post office tower from the balcony. It felt like you could see the future in its possibility, a beautifully, immaculately pared back future that might actually include the rest of us. And H.G. Wells, who I was reading at the time, that I remember thinking that he constructed his time machine as a mechanism to ask questions about the terrible divisions in society. And he conjectured if those timeless problems were a result of the limit of resources or indeed the limits of our humanity. And he had grown up beneath stairs, spent his childhood like so many working class families in darkness. And his first memories were of basements, his parents serving beneath stairs, their peers toiling in cellars, in stores, in mines, all out of sight below ground, so often away from daylight and fresh air. And he resented it, what it represented, how it limited a class and acculturated feelings of difference and disadvantage. He grew up hankering after light and vistas and inspiration. He wanted to be able to climb up high and gaze out toward the horizon and dream. And although that dream of high-rise utopia, it wouldn't fulfill expectations, that aspiration to offer platforms from which to dream, I think they quite rightly continue to persist. And my sincere wish is that in East London, that we find a way to devise our own time machine, that we craft a vessel to nurture dreams, to occasionally convey young minds beyond the constraints and convention, to circumscribe mediocre expectation through contact with beauty. And I hope that offered the right tools to gaze out at distant horizons, to travel beyond the world mapped out by the established curricula, that our young will craft the beautiful futures that they deserve. And the collection centre, as I see it, it's going to offer a unique museum store experience, a glorious storehouse of possibilities. But we want to complement that with the digital infrastructure to capture the stories and the reactions of those who visit. So that over time, this space will become as much loved for its collection of wonderful things as it will be a body of wonderful reflections. And after this really testing couple of years in which sharing and social communion has felt so problematic, I long for an opportunity to share, to celebrate, and to remember, and to do so together. Next slide, please. And then a few minutes walk away, we're building a twin for our collection, a museum. Designed by O'Donnell and Toomey, it's, in my mind, a 4-story jewel of a building that when complete, it's going to allow us to tell stories that reflect the very best of human creativity, to do so to the creative disciplines that are celebrated by all of the other cultural institutions on the park. Here we can showcase fashion, design, architecture, art, and do so within lenses that demonstrate the diversity and international scope of our collection and their power to speak to us all. Although this will offer so much of what all great museums offer in great spaces, collections, exhibition staff, I am also, and I think particularly after this last couple of years, I'm determined that it offers something else too. Next slide, please. As I intimated just in that previous bit, that I actually kind of grew up in a kind of pretty untrendy bit of London long before music conferred those sorts of neighbourhoods with any kind of coolness. It was a place that even in my early childhood felt very far away from everything. And we lived on a street where the buses terminated, and I adored it. I adored the sleepy neighbourhood, and it was one of those neighbourhoods where everyone looked out for everyone. But as I reached teenage, I slowly began to begrudge that suffocating quiet and grew to dislike that quality of suburban tranquility that I guess it's antipathy to most people who are young. And at night, I would spend long hours listening to that particularly beautiful soft rumble of distant trains sashaying along sidings. And I would fantasize about their ultimate destination. And I would catch the sort of crooning of lost drunks stumbling from night buses. And I'd always wonder about where they might have lost their way. And I'd track the reflected beams of car headlights across the ceiling until they would evaporate into the darkness. And I'd wish that I could follow. And so the very first moment that I could resource independent travel, I traveled Western Europe before I could afford it, Soviet Union before I should have, Central America when the Foreign Office actually forbade it, Asia before it felt obligatory, then of course Africa. Africa, it's the birthplace of my parents, and it became an early obsession, and I bust up its spine in my 20s, traversed its deserts and rivers, and spent time unpicking histories from the High Atlas to the Kalahari, and I fell in love with African perspectives upon histories that I thought I knew. And I was utterly captivated by the narratives that could be pulled completely intact from ancient sites. And I was thrilled by sensing stories that might be drawn untouched through archaeology. It was history there to be encountered without fuss or preciousness. And it was a continent that utterly beguiled me with its incredible materiality. And alongside the stuff of great history, it also gave visitors a chance to feel proximity to its intangible culture, to experience ambient living histories, from huge epic living oral histories to glorious performance and masquerades. And it would be in pursuit of these histories, in form and content, that would drive the greater part of my career. That I would eventually go abroad to work for the Smithsonian, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, but it would be extended periods living abroad that would rekindle my love for this city, London, the city of my birth. And so amidst the COVID outbreak and looming recession, culture wars, Brexit, I came back to London in 2020. And to this role of finding this new museum and trying to answer that question of how we might nurture, inspire, and liberate the sorts of young minds that I think came from the sort of similar backgrounds to mine. And so I've drawn upon my experience in thinking about how we might actually think about our operational approach at V&A East. And it's one of those, for me, the talisman is actually one of my travels, a very kind of brief period of one of my trips to Morocco. And it was actually one Ramadan a couple of decades ago, and I was stuck on the road to Taous, which is an area of southern Morocco that sits on the upper lip of the Sahara. And it's a place where genuinely you don't want to get stranded at any time of year. But when drivers are tired and hungry, these roads can be even more challenging. And we've driven for ages, in fact, until the road had begun to fail. And then we'd gone on. And when the track that had taken the place of the road actually gave way to the desert, we forged on between rocks and soft sand. And very occasionally we might build up a bit of speed, but over and over again, the momentum of our journey was frustrated. And however many times that we stopped, Hassan, who was my driver, he would simply refuse to accept that that was it. And he would find a way out, and slowly we would push on. And over the kilometers, we were getting increasingly exhausted. And so we stopped talking. And I kind of filled the time by kind of dreaming, because I was absolutely starving. You know, that time of year, a kind of Ramadan of not eating, of not drinking. And so I would sort of gorge myself in fantasies of onion and tomato salads, of smoky grilled lamb, of garlic infused beef kebabs. Imagine plates of honey-based sweets and mint tea. And we were heading towards a guest house, one of those guest houses in the desert where the drivers of, you know, once upon a time they would have been on camels, but now that they have huge camel-laden pantechnicons, huge kinds of trucks that drive across the desert for kind of days on end, and they come off the road into these amazing hotels off the trans-desert highways, and they are hotels that are known for their wonderful sort of gastronomy. And so I had dreams, you know, of the sorts of food that we would eat. But as we drew up outside the hotel at the end of the day, and Hassan switched the engine off, I realized that that probably wasn't going to be what we were going to be doing at the end of this journey. You know, almost anywhere else on Earth, this kind of three-sided corrugated iron shack would not have dared to call itself a hotel. But out here where we were, any safe, clean, stationary refuge from the winds, it felt pretty palatial. And so we went in to this small space, lit by kind of kerosene lamps, shared a small wash basin, and we luxuriated in every drop of salty, soapy, cool water. And then we joined the other men reclining on soft woven carpets on the floor on the kind of multi-purpose central room. It was impossible not to feel at home. And our limbs touching and intertwining, all of us kind of strangers and friends. And that soft, hypnotic rattle and squeak of the iron twisting the corrugated roof in the wind. And then in the background, that comforting hum of hot water boiling. And somewhere at the back of the room, in the darkness, the slow kind of deep breaths of a child sleeping. And after that kind of merciless journey, with the evening approaching, of course, you want to drift off to sleep. But my exhaustion was absolutely no match for the magnitude of my hunger and thirst. And like everyone else in the room, I knew that sleep and food would have to wait until after sunset. And as seems common to every single Ramadan dusk, the dying few moments that they just won't give way, the day will not go. And so you could actually see the sun slip low enough so that its rays began to sort of slip beneath the lower edge of the door. And then breath by breath, the shadows crept over our bodies and chased the day away. And I lay my head back on the carpet, closed my eyes, briefly inhaled And I just smelt that incredible, incredible aroma of mint leaves, of warm bodies, of couscous. And at last the day was gone. And then after prayer, we shared stories of home, of family, and our host began to gather the ingredients to make something that we'd been all longing for, I would imagine, all day. And even in the limited space of the single room, the hotel owner, he took care to prepare the mint tea in the right age-old manner. And I watched him, as I've watched patriarchs all over North Africa and the Middle East, throwing strong, dark tea leaves into a pot, allowing the mixture to brew. And as he worked, he looked around the room, studying each guest in turn, seeming to look at each one with a kind of forensic attention, identifying in the corner a stranger's discomfort, sensing their isolation in a room of chatter, and his eyes directing his daughter to fetch that guest a newspaper, to light a kerosene lamp beneath so they could read it. He took off his wristwatch, a timepiece that had been so loved over so many generations that it had been polished to the edge of destruction. And its once gilt edges are now a kind of dull brass. And as he pointed to its face, I think not to suggest the passage of time, but that this particular moment mattered. I mean, hospitality, it's an art form in these Muslim cultures, but this was a virtuoso at work. And then he began this long, beautiful story of getting lost on the Sahel that ended with the Islamic saying, live in this world as though you are a stranger, as though you are a traveler. And once the ice had been broken, but he thought no one would notice, he began to move the lamp, giving a young truck driver the choice. You know, he was a shy man, giving him the chance to move back out of the into the shadows. And it was the kind of process of choreography all evening, subtle choreography, barely noticeable, barely perceptible interventions to make sure that every single guest was comfortable, happy, welcome, feeling at home. And that little corrugated iron hotel in the desert rocked with laughter. Even Hassan smiled. And the liquid was strained, copious amounts of sugar added. A small man who arrived late stood in the doorway. A little more sugar was added to the tea, giving a kind of viscosity to it, a sort of glassy sheen, before it was returned back to the fire and held on a rolling boil as fistfuls of fresh mint were bruised and pressed into the pot. And then the real magic began to happen, a kind of aromatic alchemy that seemed to begin with smells erupting with an incendiary ferocity across the room. And that amazing smell of spearmint and old gunpowder tea. And then, when you know it's ready, that faint tang of burnt toffee. And now the room was completely silent, the weight barely tolerable. We all watched the golden piping hot liquid being poured from pot to pot 3 deliberate times, each time from a greater height than the last, drawing air through the beverage to enhance the flavour and leaving the tea with a frothy head. It was served in glasses lacquered with years of sticky brown tea glaze. Steaming hot lanterns of gold were passed from guest to guest around the room. And I was like most of the other people there, hadn't consumed anything since dawn. And I could have quenched my thirst on water, but I wanted to pay respect to the demands of the day by ending it well. I didn't mind burning my lip on the edge of the gas. But the ingredients, the taste, it reveals itself as a kind of cascade of flavours. First, the kick of the mint, a fresh, peppery flavour that was strong enough to cut through what followed a caramel-like sweetness of sugar. And then the earthy flavour of tea. And then a softer spearmint sensation on the tongue. And for bodies craving calories, sugar, it hits like a slap. firing nerve endings, drawing open pupils and electrifying senses, and then the mellowing afterglow as the mint began its work to steady and recalibrate nerves. I mean, these are cultural traditions that remain an important mechanism of social cohesion. We could have probably have been engaged in something similar in Muslim countries across the world at that very moment. This was a quality of experiential encounter that I remember from studying philosophy that Kant would have seen as special. It's the apex of societal development, moments when communities are bound by shared experience, by mutual respect and trust, when it feels like values truly coincide. And we followed our tea with a simple but good meal of thick lentil soup. It's one of those meals that had the unmistakable flavour of Morocco, that deep range of sweet and savoury flavours that in traditional European kitchens might have felt slightly awkward. But here, they tasted perfection. And then there were more stories of family and friendship, stories of love and community. But that evening, that tiny room on the edge of the desert, miles from the nearest town, it felt like it had such a profound sense of place. It felt like the centre of the world. And decades on from that simple meal on the road to Taus, that evening still continues to haunt me. It's remained the emotional yardstick against which I have aspired to measure my own hospitality, to judge the quality of welcome and sense of place wherever I've subsequently lived and worked. And in thinking about a new museum for the 21st century, it's that sense of connection between strangers, that palpable feeling of being part of something that I would seek to replicate. How do buildings and their stewards create such a powerful sense of communion, suggest shared narrative, develop such a potent emotional pull? How do we build a welcome that might evoke in our visitors a feeling of being under the stewardship of people who really care? If that hotel on the road to Taus was some sort of tonal guide, then I guess generosity, humility, authenticity. And we must also feel open to those from traditional museum audiences. Race, cultural diversity, age, class, or education attainment cannot be barriers to engagement, should not connote the nature of cultural ease or the degree of comfort that our visitors might feel. Everyone should feel drawn by the compelling sense of place, by the sense of community, by the acknowledgement of the varied routes that we might have come to meet in this place, but also by the possibility of a shared social intercourse and by the chance of self-actualization. Though difference and diversity might be celebrated, there should be the possibility that we might also transcend them. These, in my mind, are the qualities of great cultural institutions. They become spaces where we can both be ourselves and come together, where we might expect to find a welcome, to find solace, to find inspiration and credible praxis. But to do any of this, we must, like the hotel on the road to Taus, find the shared narrative to complement the shared space. We need our visitors to feel that our museum is a place of communion, where we are elegantly drawn together by shared stories, by history. This new cultural landscape requires new kinds of institutions, museums that re-energize collections for new audiences and recalibrate themselves to the concerns, rhythms, and modes of production of a new age. And perhaps the inspiration for that museological innovation might lie in the past, in the timeless wisdom of coal, the profound hospitality of a traditional North African welcome, or in the heritage of ceaseless intellectual investigation that our V&A represents. But I think the critical thing is that we can't do this alone, and nor should we try. Our critical partnerships beyond institutions around the world, must be with the communities of East London, tapping into that rich, glorious history of making to transform lives. This, as a project, is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build an experiential storehouse of art and design, and to pair it with an experimental partnership-based gallery and exhibition platform. And I think it needs to be a space within which we can forge opportunities for reconciliation, for account, a space within which we can acknowledge the complex and difficult histories that we know we must, but also negotiate new relationships of equity, empathy, openness, and do so with the cultures, communities, and artists and makers of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for such a wonderfully inspiring and impassioned talk tonight. It reminds me, and I suspect others too, that, you know, really this has been a very tough time over the last few years, and we're all, I think, at the bottom of our hearts, we're yearning for this kind of inspiration and people in the creative industries to come together and to hear inspiring stories like the ones that you've told us tonight. So thank you very much for sharing those with us.